as we begin to return to the workplace. And the donut model, I think, is a really interesting concept because it is this idea of the impact of doing too little or too much and sort of staying in the sweet spot, the donut itself. So if we can move on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think we can pass the agenda. We'll get through this. So this is where we'll talk a little bit more about this idea. So we're really reconsidering our approach to our economy and the way of doing business by looking beyond growth. And in doing so, we create a more prosperous and harmonious environment. And by taking this on as individuals, we can it can feel overwhelming, but there are many levers that we can pull in the AEC industry in our day-to-day work to not only change our way of thinking, but also to put this into practice. So today we'll be discussing our recipes for success for approaching sustainability, wellness, and inclusion in our work. And so hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll feel empowered to apply this towards your everyday actions. So let's move on from there. So this is sort of the historical perspective. Traditionally we look at economic theory that growth is always good, and we see it in the headlines that GDP growth, or when our companies address shareholders, increase value. Individual companies often feel they have no choice but to follow the model. And where negative externalities pop up in the process, we're told the free market is so efficient it will address those issues with organically created solutions. And this has taught us to be neoliberalism, which is a mouthful. So let's take a look at the donut. So the idea of this, again, it's Kate Raworth, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, is about meeting the needs of all within the meaning of the planet. She calls it donut economics for both its shape, but also the quest to find the sweet spot for humanity. And she explains it as it's a worldwide goal to ensure that no one is left in the central hole, falling short on life's essentials, while simultaneously ensuring that human activity doesn't overshoot the outer crust by putting too much pressure on Earth's life supporting systems. In other words, the aim is to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And that really is kind of the crux of everything that we're going to be talking about, is finding that sweet spot within sustainability, within wellness, and within the diversity and inclusion that Diane will be talking about. So one of the things, just a starting point for the well portion of this, is the well building standard. It's aligned very similarly to LEED. It has 4 different levels that are based on points achieved, and the categories are air, water, nourishment, light, movement, thermal comfort, sound, materials, mind, and community. And what we want to do is focus a little bit more on kind of the biophilia, which we've all heard about, I hope, and if you haven't, you're going to learn about it, but biophilia as an aspect of well. And the guy who coined this is E.O. Wilson, and he was a Harvard professor and a famous entomologist. And he developed this concept of biophilia that really what it states is that contact with nature is a basic human need, not a cultural amenity, not an individual preference, but a universal primary need. And just as we need healthy food and regular exercise to flourish and live, we also need connections with our natural world. And I think that is a fascinating place to be. And what I'm going to be describing to you is these patterns of biophilia that were coined by a company called Terrapin Bright Green that's out of New York City, and Bill Browning, who's one of the people at Terrapin Bright Green. And I'm only going to go through a few of these because we don't have a whole lot of time. We want to get on to all of our topics and be able to have a really nice Q&A with all of you. So the first one is like the easiest one to think about, and it's the one that I think most people jump to for biophilia, is it's this connection to nature that E.O. Wilson was talking about. And when you look at this image of a project you see this green wall, and everybody, I think, just automatically goes, oh, biophilia is green walls. Let's put in a green wall. We've got biophilia conquered. It's actually a little bit more than that. And when we mentioned in our biographies a little bit earlier, the idea of neuroscience, there's neuroscience that is behind all of these concepts. And we'll take this step by step. So this connection to nature is something that we've seen studied through neuroscience, and they've seen a reduction of stress when there are elements of nature, or aspects of nature within our workplace. They've seen our blood pressure go down, our heart rate smooth out. It improves cognition. They've done tests on that, and it positively affects our moods. So these are things that, yes, they're pleasant, but we are wired, our brains are wired to really respond to this. And so if you think about that donut, the absence of this, the absence of nature, would be something similar to solitary confinement. You have nothing. You don't have very much light. You don't have any plants. You have no connection to nature. And Diane and I have both participated in a conference called the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, where they talked about solitary confinement, and that they studied the people who had been in solitary confinement for a number of years, and they were their eyesight was diminished because they didn't have any perspective. Their brains had changed and they were confused very easily. They lost sense of direction where they are in space. Whereas when you do have all of this, and maybe the outside of the donut is you have so much connection to nature that you're overwhelmed. I can't imagine what that would be, that would be negative, but I'm trying to find, that outside the donut, inside the donut. So let's go to the next one. So that's that connection to nature. That's an easy one. The next one is the presence of water. And I think this is such an amazing thing. It's sort of an obvious. We can't live without water. So when we're reminded of water, whether it's actually in our environment or maybe there's a simulation of water, we really respond positively to that too. So it's a condition that enhances the experience of a place through seeing, hearing, or touching water. And, when I think about if you're in a hotel lobby and they have a water feature, for example, the first thing you want to do is go up to it and you watch it. You're fascinated by it and you want to poke your finger through the waterfall that's cascading in that. We are just, again, wired for that. The next one is complexity and order. This is number 10 out of the 14. So these start to become a little bit more interesting as you go towards the 14th pattern of biophilia. And this is this idea of rich sensory information, a spatial hierarchy that's found in nature, positive impact on perceptual and psychological stress responses. Again, bringing us dopamine and oxytocin. It's coming out of our brain. We get this pleasure response. And if you look at this image, there's a lot of things going on. You have the struts in the ceiling off to the upper right, which is really fun to kind of look at. Our eye is drawn to that. You look at the drop ceiling and it has this sort of perforated metal canopy that's mimicking the idea of clouds a little bit, and the different diffusion of light. And if you look back at the end of this image, you can see sort of these organic shapes. They're almost like a leaf-like structure. So again, you're reminded of nature, but it's also not just the nature. It's just this complexity of what you're looking at, and your eye is drawn to all of that. So the next one. This is one of my favorite ones, this idea of prospect. Again, it's kind of intuitive, where you think about, we as human beings have been wired to want to see what's in front of us. We want to see what's coming at us. It's something that is part of feeling safe, that you're not being surprised by something, popping in front of you with where you had no idea. So in architecture, I think this is a really fun idea of designing with this sense of being able to see a certain distance, to see out there, to know what's going on, to have these box forms with glass and being able to see out over this atrium, or in the atrium be able to see up above you, this idea of prospects. And so they describe it in as unimpeded views, this idea of surveillance. And it, again, obviously, it reduces stress. It also reduces boredom because you're seeing motion, you have things going on. It reduces your irritation, fatigue, and increases perceived sense of safety. So again, I think this is a great one to think about. And as designers, we may be doing this intuitively, but when you start to understand the neuroscience behind this, it starts to give it a lot more depth of understanding of why you're doing these things. And I think that that's fascinating. This is also one of the last of the 14. This is number 12, actually, and it's refuge. And just as we had prospect before, now you have this idea of refuge, of being protected, of being maybe even isolated, but kind of having your back covered. And if you've a designer or a facilities person, you definitely know that some of the most common complaints are people do not like to have their back to the door of an office. They don't like to have their back to a corridor where people are coming up behind them, that same sense of you want to feel safe. So this idea of refuge is a place for withdrawal from environmental conditions or the main flow of activity in which the individual is protected from behind and overhead. And in this photo, this is Snoetta's design of the Wild Reindeer Center Pavilion in Norway. It's such a beautiful spot. I would love to sit there. I would definitely work with my laptop in this space. So I'm going to take a pause here and ask you if you have any questions, comments, anything that you want to talk about that I can address on just this segment on the biophilia and neuroscience.
Mary Lee, we did have a couple of questions come in. First of all, a fairly basic one is, how do we know that biophilia really has an impact?
Yeah, well, and again, it's through studies and research. And I mentioned ANFA, Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, and that's exactly what that group does, is they are um, combining architects and designers with research scientists, and they are proving through those studies and research. So, you have different case studies or different, user groups and control groups. And so that's how they find out that this really does have an impact, that it is there, and it has, I mean, honestly, when you talk about productivity in the workplace, I would pay attention to these.
Definitely. And in terms of your donut model, what
Yeah.
would be doing too little or too much?
Yeah, I kind of said that at the beginning, but again, I think if you're doing too little, you're not paying attention. And you could be creating environments where people feel bored. Like if you're in a high paneled cubicle, I think that's a very boring environment. And not very excited or turned on, and you might have a stress reaction, kind of like that solitary confinement thing that I was telling about. And then doing too much, I kind of can't imagine what doing too much would be. Um, but I suppose you could overdo anything and it may become chaotic. Maybe refuge. Let's just take this beautiful picture, and maybe it becomes too much refuge, too much of a capsule, too much isolation, and that isn't a good thing either.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions.
Okay, cool. Let's move on. I'm going to turn it over to Diane.
All right. So while the biophilia part was a really interesting way of looking at how the environment affects the way that we um, feel in our bodies and connect to the natural world, or are not able to connect, and how that affects our performance, we also look at this as a matter of accessibility, because when you provide spaces where people can truly flourish, you're removing barriers that perhaps weren't even recognized as barriers before. But as we get more and more educated and more empathetic to how different people perceive the environment, we start to see where we can improve and give people what they need, because we've learned how the body processes sensory information from the environment. So we've been calling this enhanced accessibility because it's something that we hear about from our clients. They want to know how they can improve their their employee groups' sense of belonging and sense of being acknowledged and recognized in the organization. And so they want their facilities to reflect that. You know, accessibility for a long time, architects have just looked at it from the lens of universal design, which these are things that I'm sure everybody's familiar with, even if it's not a specific um, memory of the universal design set of 7 concepts, which I have up on the screen here. But this has just been incorporated into the design process, and we think about things in these terms naturally and reflexively at this point. So we're already, because of codes, because of how the building codes work and how ADA works in America, we already think about how to accommodate some barriers in the space, but it doesn't really affect what we're now learning about how the brain works. And so we've moved beyond the simple accessibility of code requirements into an enhanced accessibility that looks beyond that. And neurodiversity is a big piece of that. Neurodiversity is an umbrella term that refers to a host of different neurological variations that are found in the human beings. So it can be people with dyslexia, ADHD, PTSD, Tourette's, all kinds of things. It's often, most often, used in relation to people on the autism spectrum. And this is becoming more and more uh, visible in society, in media, in entertainment, and things like that. And it makes sense that it would be, because we're getting more and more aware of how many people have this condition. And if you're neurodiverse versus neurotypical, um, then you perceive things differently, and that affects your experience of being in the workplace or being in the world in general. For a lot of our projects and tech companies, we figure 50% of employees in tech companies in Silicon Valley are probably on the milder end of the autism spectrum. Um, and in terms of the general population, estimates from the CDC are 1 in 69 children are diagnosed with autism, and globally the estimate is 1 in 150. So this is a fairly sizable chunk of the population, and unfortunately, if you look at the numbers, um, proportionally they're underemployed, because the workplace has not historically recognized their differences in a way that allows them to be comfortable in the workplace. So just a quick uh, example here. I like to start with this because color blindness is a very common variation, and 1 in 12 women, 1 in 12 men, and 1 in 200 women are estimated to have some form of color blindness. And so to me, that is really highlighting the fact that when we're designing for companies with thousands of employees, this is a huge slice of people who don't perceive the most basic question that we may have, which is, do you see what I see? And the answer is going to be no. No, they are not seeing what we see when we're designing for our um, vision, our design vision. And we rarely talk about this. Some design professionals in graphic design or web design do talk about color blindness, but it's not very often brought up in architecture or interior design. And to me, that's a reminder that there are things that are so widespread and so common, and yet no one ever speaks to them. So I like to use that as an example of how we might all step back and reconsider whether we're having the same experience as other people in the space. So is it a myth that individuals on the spectrum are always gifted in math? Probably. It is true that some autistic people use a different part of their brain to solve math problems. They use the part of their brain that is normally used for identifying faces and objects in neurotypical people. So technology allows us to see how the brain actually varies in its um, function and processing of sensory input in people who are wired a little bit differently. But the idea that everybody's a math genius doesn't really hold up. They can just as easily be gifted in art or language or nothing at all, because truly they are just like everybody else. They happen to be wired differently in the brain for some functions, but otherwise they have the same kind of variation that you find in the general population. What is kind of interesting is that a lot of the variations in processing can lend certain skills to things like code breaking or pattern recognition. So dyslexics may be very good at pattern recognition because they're seeing visual symbols in a different format than neurotypicals, or that's one example. From what I understand, certain countries' entire defense departments are employing people on the spectrum because they have a certain uh, skill set that really lends itself to some tasks. Um, so it's definitely in businesses' best interest to understand that and start to basically take advantage of a vastly untapped employment pool. So there is a company called Specialist Cerna, which is a Danish company, and they have started several years back with programs that help companies and Fortune 500 companies start neurodiversity programs. And as you can see here, the range of companies are quite broad. SAP was one of the first, and they have the most advanced and mature program at this point. But what's interesting to me about this is that going to companies and explaining the things that they've missed along the way and finding ways to work with them to create good partnerships between people on the spectrum and the employers who would like to employ them is really making great strides towards closing the gap. And it's a win-win for everybody involved. What does this mean from a in design point of view is that we just need to build our empathy muscle, and we need to start thinking about all the aspects of sensory input in an environment and how that might be perceived differently than we assume it is. So if you think of the categories, and this is a little abstract, but I'll just go through it quickly for you. If you think of the categories of sensory input, the rabbit here with its soft fur represents tactile information, and the eye is around vision, and the fox has the big ears, so he's about sound. Now, just those three alone, you can imagine that if you were processing tactile information differently or seeing things differently or more or less sensitive to sounds in your environment, all those things are going to have a really high impact on whether or not you feel comfortable in a space. The next three categories are the odors in a space, and I think technically they lump that in with taste, although I don't know how you would really perceive taste in an architectural space. Um, and then we have the cat balancing on the rail is around vestibular balance. So that's literally how you are moving through space and keeping yourself, keeping track of where your body is. And proprioception is that coordination and reflexes um, to maneuver and understand how you're interacting with objects. So again, variations in how you perceive these things, variations in um, your ability to stay balanced or stay aware of yourself in space, those are going to be really important things to how you feel when you're in a space. A quick example here, this is all visual examples, but say this is a nice picture of some flowers. If you have visual processing issues, it could be as drastic as perceiving that picture like this, where it becomes pieced together in bits that are out of order. And just imagine having that applied to your perception when you walk into a cafe or a conference room. It would be really disorienting. And, it's not that we can necessarily design against this, it's just one thing to remember that people might be experiencing some of the time. And so, how can you anticipate that and possibly address it? Or address the effect of it, which is sensory overload. So, people might need a place to sit down and time out. If they're hypersensitive to bright lights, they might start seeing things white out and they can't perceive details. Or if they hit that point of overload, then they might go into visual shutdown. And these are all just visual examples, but there are similar things through all those categories of sensory input. So, as designers, we see the answer to this is not going to be one size fits all ever. It's always going to be providing a variety of spaces, an ecosystem of environments that people can choose based on what they need that day. So, that's something that we've promoted for a long time, just based on activity based workspace and giving people the latitude to choose the kind of environment they need for the task that they're doing. It comes even more to the forefront when you're talking about this kind of sensory processing variation, because if it's to the point where people can't function, they can't focus or perform, then they end up being pushed out of the workforce and the employers aren't able to benefit and they're not able to benefit. So it's really important as we move through this and learn more to recognize that these things have been hampering employers from providing workspace that really is inclusive. So I can pause here and see if anybody has any questions. I know that we're doing pretty good on time, I think. So are there any questions that we want to do before we move on to the next section?
Diana, I see a couple. One that you'd mentioned specialist earner, and
Yes.
wondering how that model works exactly, because it sounds like they're on the cusp of really helping with people engage in the environment.
Yes. Yes, so they're a really interesting company. It was founded by a man whose son was born and diagnosed on the spectrum, and so he became intimately aware of everything his son was faced with in school and in eventual employment and getting along in society. So his goal was to create a company that is a software company that basically employed people on the spectrum, which he did. But where they really start making the difference is when they're working with these other companies, and I've gone to some of their hiring seminars, which they partner with local social services departments, and they go to an employer's place of work and they spend 4 weeks. At least this is the way the seminar that I attended worked. They spend 4 weeks there working with the hiring managers and teaching them about the kinds of challenges that they're up against, meeting with the candidate pool that the local social services has identified as being possible candidates for this employer, and then giving them chances to interact in very non-traditional ways. So instead of an interview situation where you're sitting there and trying to communicate question and answer style, straight face on, eye contact, things that might be a little bit challenging for someone on the spectrum, they'll introduce all kinds of ways that they can interact with, test runs and problem sets that people can work through with the employers, and they can have lunch meetings and they can interact in ways that diffuse some of those natural tendencies for them to get tripped up by the standard way of doing things. And it even gets down to the point of they will go and talk to the building security at personnel in the lobby and say, hey, some people are coming tomorrow for some interviews and they're probably going to be really um, nervous about being late. So they might show up half an hour early and they might just stand around in the lobby and kind of pace back and forth and and not want to talk to you, but don't get alarmed. They should be here. Expect them, and they are just going to be coming in for their interview. So be aware of that. And they set up circumstances so that those people can succeed. So it's a really interesting program. I really am intrigued by it.
Yeah, I have to definitely do some research on that. One other thing that came up, well, actually, we're all now sort of living in a remote world. So how has remote work, does that create more opportunity for neurodiverse individuals? Does that help them?
Well, this is something that's been being discussed during the last year, definitely, because people think, well, this is great. It solves the problem. People who are neurodiverse can just stay at home. They want to be at home. They're in control of their environment there, no problem. Where I think that falls um, through the cracks is, part of working successfully is having those personal connections and building those relationships. And that's where people on the spectrum are often challenged, anyways. And if you just let them be a remote worker and kind of remain isolated without providing them opportunities to overcome those challenges and make meaningful connections, then I don't think you're doing them any favors in the long run. I think all of us are looking forward to a future of work that allows us to have more time perhaps at home, or come into the office less than we used to. Maybe that's the way to say it. But I don't think that it's necessarily going to benefit neurodiverse people to give them more opportunity to isolate themselves, or um, not be included in the general social and work communities of their employers, because that's missing a big part of what it takes to be a successful organization.
Got it. I don't see any other questions. We can move.
Okay.
Bruce, one person is asking, could we put the name of the company in the chat? And I'm not sure if
Yes.
okay,
The
beautiful.
specialist journal. Yeah, I
Okay,
can. Yeah, I can add that.
absolutely. And just out of curiosity, Diane, you mentioned that companies often overlook much of this, and it's pretty much a new science that people are bringing to the forefront of the workplace. Not a new science, but something new that people are bringing to the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, what are the things that are most detrimental? And this might be not a great question to ask, but what items are really most detrimental that you have to say stop?
Right.
You really have to pay attention to this.
Right. Well, I can give you an example of, I think vision processing is one of the most easy to overwhelm an individual if they have the wrong kind of visual input. So imagine that you're someone on the spectrum and you have hypersensitivity to lights of a certain intensity. And so they show you to your desk and you sit down and you try to work, and the lights near you, this is, for a long time, this was kind of focused around fluorescent lights, but now even with LEDs, it's the same thing. People will say, I can't stand the light above me. It is flickering, it is too bright, it is whatever it is. And they'll go and retrofit it themselves. They'll tape a piece of paper up there to create a diffuse shade, or they'll secretly, start sitting somewhere else, or whatever it is that they can do to mitigate it for themselves. And that is an example of just not understanding and thinking that somebody might be a little too demanding, or that they might be looking for special treatment. And the reality is that someone on the spectrum might process vision visual input differently. They might see light flickering in a way that I can't perceive. They might hear frequencies coming from the HVAC vent that I can't hear. So when people ask for accommodation, they may be viewed as someone who's high maintenance. And in actuality, they have a very legitimate reason to ask for what they're asking for, and it goes unnoticed, or even, you know, in the worst cases, it will drive the person out of the company, because there's a truism that what annoys a neurotypical person will break an autistic person. So if you sit somebody in a desk where they hear the ding of the elevator every time it arrives, you know, a neurotypical person might get accustomed to that and not even notice it. Whereas a person on the spectrum may say, I can't work here, I quit. And they just don't come back. And it's because um, it's so much more impactful to them and their nervous system.
Very interesting. Very
It
interesting.
really
Thank
is.
you.
I think it's fascinating. So I can talk all day, but I won't. Okay.
Okay. I think it's time for Karen.
Here
Thank
we
you so
go.
much, Diane.
Sure.
So coming back to the idea of donut economics, where we're trying to make sure that we're meeting the basic needs with that social foundation, that inner part of the donuts. We've exceeded that hole where there's a deficit, but we want that social foundation within the planetary resource constraints. So that's the outer part of the donuts. Our traditional views on sustainability have been on reducing negative impact. And that's not a bad priority, but it takes us back to the endless growth fallacy, where growth is put first. We must expand our conversation to consider other economic goals relating to health, social issues, and the environment. Because this perspective is certainly not new, there is a movement underway to set specific goals for sustainable growth for all. One of the frameworks that we'll discuss today is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. For many, this is a recipe for success for taking a comprehensive approach across multiple sectors. The goals were created in 2012 at the UN's Sustainable Development Conference in Rio de Janeiro, and the objective was to produce a universal set of goals to address the urgent environmental, social, and economic challenges facing our world. The interesting part about these goals, and why we want to highlight them today, is that sustainability goals have typically focused purely on the environmental aspect. But these goals also put weight on society and economy, recognizing that for a robust and vibrant economy, all 17 goals need to be prioritized. There's an excellent website also as a follow-up if anybody wants to read further into these specific goals. But as we've seen them grow in popularity from policymakers to Fortune 500 companies, we have many examples of how to apply the goals to our work, even through singular design decisions. So let's look at an example as it relates to materials selection. Carpet, as many people know, is predominantly made of nylon and wool. Mining raw materials to produce nylon has in many cases resulted in biodiversity loss, land conversion, and chemical pollution, among other things. However, when we recycle nylon, we can reduce that impact. There's an organization called Networks that's gone a step further and created a fast-growing business harvesting discarded fish nets from the ocean, and in doing so, reducing the impact of negative externalities in the process. This would be a great story already, but Networks is also working on creating economic opportunities for local coastal communities, including business practices that promote economic health, principles of fair trade, and a global supply chain that gives international brands the opportunity to source a premium product from a positive social and environmentally oriented organization. This gives coastal communities more transparency, dependable pricing, and sustainable funding for local conservation practices. When we compare this activity to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we can be working towards 5 or more goals at the same time. So here you can see that in doing this work, Networks is addressing clean water and sanitation, decent work and economic growth, reduced inequality, responsible consumption and production, and life below the water. The connectedness of the UN Sustainable Development Goals outlined in this example also help to illustrate the complexity of balancing the environmental, social, and economic elements between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation of the donuts, and the utility of a framework such as this one to inform decision-making and goal setting. And I'm open to questions if we have any.
Yeah, Corinne, questions that would be, can you provide any specific examples of companies that use the UN SDGs as a framework?
Yeah, a couple that I know about are the Boston Properties and Kilroy Realty. They both have used a subset of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to frame their sustainability objectives and describe progress towards those goals. And both have done that in a very public way. Kilroy Realty includes that in their corporate sustainability report. If you pull that up, which is public, from 2019, they have a really nice graphic that outlines the 7 or so UN Sustainable Development Goals that they feel align with their business practice and very specific objectives that they're targeting to help meet those goals. Boston Properties does something similar on their website. Both are really nice examples of how you think through the application of these development goals within different market sectors.
That's great. Are you familiar with GRESB? GRESB, I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing it correctly. It's the Global Real Estate Sustainability Goals, and it's really from an investment real estate perspective, how they show investors that they're actually investing in sustainable type of processes.
Yep, I am familiar with that.
And is it, how does it relate to the UN SDGs, or does it?
I think they are sort of parallel endeavors. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are I think they're most useful in thinking through setting goals and defining objectives and decisions that help you reach that. I think GRESB is sort of an umbrella above that. So the actions that might be informed by the UN Sustainable Development Goals would then filter up into the GRESB reporting.
Great, thank you very much.
Bruce, I have one here. I'm just, there's a question around, and this might be open up to Mary Lee, Karen, and Diane. As we look at the workplace, and as we, Mary Lee, you said in the very beginning that biophilia is, helps bring purpose and whatnot to life in the workplace. We're just curious about how all of this brings purpose, and what are, the key ways we can communicate that.
I think from my perspective, and Diane and Karen, please add in, but from my perspective, I think everything that we've talked about today,
That we are including diversity inclusion into.
yeah, it's some of it is just simply being more aware. I mean, as soon as you start to understand that when we're providing places where people work, there's more there than just an aesthetic, and there's more there than the dollar of the build out of the space. And I think as soon as you become more aware of the sustainability issues, which are not new, but we have sort of greenwashed a lot of it, and we've not paid as much attention, and I think, one of the things, I think Karen mentioned it, was, today we're more that it's become dire enough that we need to be thinking about regeneration, not just slowing our consumption down, but regenerating the things that we've destroyed. And I'm thinking in terms of the biophilia, it's about, again, just paying attention to what the science is saying, because it is scientifically based of, how we respond to different aspects of our environment. And as soon as you're aware of those things, then I think that you can create more thoughtful environments that actually do promote productivity, as opposed to boredom and stress. And I think, Diane, you can answer from your perspective, and Karen add on to, more than what I just said.
One note to quickly add in there is just the idea of the donut model and thinking through that social foundation. So as Kate Raworth describes it, that inner part of the donut is the social foundation. And so where we may typically think about that as access to basic needs, it could also be access to environments that encourage neurodiversity, equity across neurodiverse individuals.
Yeah.
That is that social foundation, and we need to make sure that we're establishing that foundation before we can sort of expand beyond that.
Yeah, I would say from the enhanced accessibility view, it's just, another step towards that utopian society of the future of, Star Trek: The Next Generation, where you don't have to work for money and everybody is treated equally and everyone has a chance to do meaningful work. And, it's recognizing all the ways that we've been hamstringing ourselves and finding ways to incorporate that awareness into the design process, because design is truly a thoughtful exercise and you are trying to be empathetic to the people who will use the space and put yourself in their shoes. And so the more we can learn to do that, the better off everybody will be. More
Really
voices.
nice.
Yeah, more
Yeah,
voices.
really nice. More voices. And so, as y'all know, we're a lot of organizations are looking at the data that we collect and what we do with the data. In thinking about the 3 topics that you reviewed today, can you give us 2 or 3 data points that we should really be collecting information on these topics? That might be off the cuff, but I'm just curious about the KPIs that you would recommend us really, looking into. And maybe it's soft data rather than hard data.
I can say for me that we've been working with clients who have multiple ways of reaching out to their populations. And so some of it is the anonymized or the soft sources of what's on the bulletin boards, what's on the chatter, what's in the community discussion around accessibility and inclusivity. And then there's the hard data of how many requests for accommodations have you received? How many have been acted on? How many have been dismissed? So you can start to match those up and say, are people really asking for what they need, or are they afraid of the stigma of being labeled high maintenance? Are they, if somebody with PTSD doesn't want to identify themselves as having PTSD, how do they say, I need to move my desk because where I am makes me feel really edgy and I feel uncomfortable. I need to be somewhere else. How do they ask for that? So if you can find ways, and technology can help with this, with equalizing the platform and letting somebody ask for what they want without identifying themselves. Sometimes it wouldn't work for that PTSD person because they want to move their desk, but it could work for somebody else who finds a barrier and they say, I'll just anonymously report this and it can be addressed and I don't have to identify myself as the one who needed it. I mean, those are some of the things I see in the clients we're working with.
And Diane, do you work across through to HR as well? Are you working to educate real estate and then through HR?
We do work with the HR on these things because they're usually part of the conversation. And if there's any special interest groups within the organization, we get their representatives in the discussion. So it does bleed over into that for sure.
We're actually running out of time right now, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Mary Lee, Karen, and Diane for a wonderful session. This has been really well prepared and we really enjoy hearing your things. And there were a number of questions, and so we've tried to provide resources for people who've been listening. Thank you very much, and
Yes.
wish everybody a good day. And
Thank you.
do want to remind everybody that's on the call that there will be a survey coming out, and please keep an eye out for it. We'd love to hear your thoughts about today's meeting.
Great. Thanks so
Thank you.
much. It was great to be invited to your meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.